Thank you for joining us at the UpTake. So, talk about what you heard from Governor Dayton today. What were the most important points for you?
Well, from the city's perspective, local government aid is a big aspect of it, and we're very cognizant of those reductions. We've made significant cuts over the last few years. We're a regional center in St. Cloud, so we have a population that more than doubles on a daily basis. Our nighttime population is about 68,000. Our daytime population is 168,000. There's a service demand that for those folks that are coming in. I strongly disagree with having that service demand being paid for by property taxes, and in fact that's why we haven't raised property taxes when we've had cuts in LGA, because I don't believe you transfer those service demands to people who pay property taxes to people who are not. So we've had to cut service, but you get to a point where you can't cut any more services. We're strong advocates of local government aid. We feel that does have a effect on services, and in our cases, that's what we've had to cut. We've cut every year. We've cut significantly. We have 50 less people working for the city of St. Cloud through attrition. We've had a hiring freeze. Our folks that are working there for the last 3 years haven't received a single increase in salary or compensation or steps or anything. And even back 4 years ago when they actually did, it was a 1%. We're down 50 employees. We've cut out of our park and recreation budget, for example, 45%. We've gone through a prioritization. We had a big winter, the fifth snowiest winter in the state's history, and that's a demand that whether you pay property taxes in our community or not, you expect when you drive on the streets there that you're going to have a plowed street. It's not going to be full of potholes, and you're going to have a cop or a firefighter when you dial 911. So local government aid is a big aspect, and I appreciated the governor's strong stance on not having those cuts. And we're going to communicate that to our legislators, as we have. It's not something new. I served in the Senate for 11 years and authored amendments on the floor to increase local government aid to regional centers and cities that have high service demands. So it's a piece of the message that I'm strongly in support of, and we'll continue to. I'll be talking. I don't think I ever have a conversation with a legislator where local government aid and property tax doesn't come up, because it is it needs to be. Again, every year there's been a fix. The sales tax, for example, in 1968 was created to help cities and counties as a temporary tax in those days. That continued to increase over the years, and it's a temporary fix. In fact, in 1991 was the last temporary increase to help cities and counties. But it's always forgotten in the legislature that those fixes that were done in the past were to help relieve property tax. Once the state becomes in a financial situation, that's forgotten, and it's always goes back to the cities. Cities have done a really good job of actually holding the line on spending and being innovative, and we've done that. In fact, I challenge everybody, as I do every year when I present the budget to the City Council, find one area in this budget that we shouldn't be doing. And I've never had anybody ever come up and say you shouldn't be spending money on this. So we're at the point now with if local government aid is cut, it's a tremendous reduction in services. But if it was eliminated, there's no way you could offset that without some type of property tax, which is unfair. And one of the things the governor said, and I tell our folks all the time, if you live in a house, you don't have a job, your property tax you still have to pay. It has nothing to do with your income or ability to pay. And my service demand, I choose to live in a low-valued home. My service demand is no different than somebody who lives in another home. And I've got a lot of seniors. We have a very growing community with a lot of seniors and folks that are on fixed income. Haven't seen any COLA increases in Social Security. We have high service demands, and somebody has to provide those basic services. So until there's a different way of doing that, and we have advocated different ways of doing that, I actually believe local government aid should be split to a local government aid, and then let regional centers have a different way of funding that, because the regional centers are a different entity than, say, Roseau is or Thief River Falls, where areas where it becomes property tax wealth versus non-property tax wealth areas. So maybe a two-tiered system. But again, it's hard to get even folks to listen to that, because the first reaction to a lot of people is local government aid is somehow welfare to cities or something that it is not. It is absolutely not, and I challenge folks to look at what some cities have had to deal with over the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a loaded term, and it's become a divisive topic. How much LGA has St. Cloud traditionally received? How much might we be looking at in terms of cuts? And you mentioned a few things that the LGA has gone toward. What else does it go toward funding in St. Cloud?
Well, I can tell you right now, our police budget alone, our public safety budget alone, is higher than the amount of LGA we receive. So one could argue, in fact, we've done a prioritization. So local government aid for us, it used to be about $13 million on an annual basis. Now it's down to $10.1 million. So we've seen in the last 3 years about over $1 million in every year, a reduction thereof in local government aid.
Under Paul Lindsay.
Yes. In fact, it started actually. We had cuts back during the Ventura administration originally, and then there was actually a surplus at one period of time, and that was because back in 1991, a trust fund was created for local government aid. That was the half-cent sales tax increase. That trust fund had a surplus in it once, and that surplus actually went back to cities and counties. But what happened as soon as the legislature found that there was a surplus, that was completely eliminated, and no longer does that happen. Actually, if you had something that actually set up a fund for local government aid, you'd see that actually, if you just stuck with it, one of those things is that the legislature creates and has eliminated those things over the years. But we've seen cuts over the years. But our funding sources is property taxes, fees, and then of course local government aid. Our most unstable source of funding that we have is local government aid. It used to be 45% of our general fund budget. It's now 22% of our general fund budget. But again, we have 20% of our property in St. Cloud is non-taxable, whether it's government, nonprofit. There's still service demands in that. So we've seen cuts. Our budget cuts they've been real cuts. We've cut each year. Last year's cut was a little under 3.9% cut in overall spending. So again, we still have to fill the potholes. We still have to plow the roads. When people dial 911, they still expect someone to respond.
And this would undoubtedly increase local property taxes.
Well, it's not an automatic, right. and I refuse to increase property taxes in the wake of local government aid cuts, because I believe it is unfair. The same argument I give to legislators, we live. I will not raise property taxes because of local government aid cuts, but that means huge service cuts, and there are still basic services that need to be provided that are critical. But we have not translated into property tax cuts, and that's why we've been advocating. But again, you can't have the same rhetoric saying that it shouldn't be going to the property taxes and then raise the property taxes. So we won't. I refuse to do that with local government aid cuts. But you get to a point where you're not going to be able to provide any services, and that's worse than anything, especially for a regional center that has a high service demand from people coming into the city.
Let's take this to the individual level for a second, away from politics. Who exactly, what hard hats, what jobs, what people, what families will be hurt by reductions or outright cuts in LGA?
Well, if cuts in LGA, it's basically you have those service demands that are there. So folks that are plowing, and there's their jobs. These people that work for the cities. We haven't laid anybody off, because I also believe strongly, and you don't lay people off when you're trying to create jobs. Yeah. But we've had through attrition, we've had a hiring freeze. I instituted a hiring freeze in March of 2008. We're down 50 employees through attrition. But you still have services that need to take place. We have 485 lane miles of roadway that needs to be plowed. So what happens there is you have those jobs, you have economic development, you talk about job creation, you need to make sure that you have roads and infrastructure and public safety. Nobody wants to expand their business in an area that doesn't have those things. You need to have quality of life issues. You have to have parks. You have to have those parks maintained. One of the things I learned a long time ago, and I've heard many speakers talk about, the biggest part of economic development is when your childhood, when you're growing up, the experience you have, the quality of life, because that's where you want to raise a family, that's where you want to work. Those are important aspects. So quality of life issues, parks, recreation, those types of things are important also. But the very basics, right now, we're at the point where the very basics are being jeopardized, because the police, the fire, the roadways, those are the things that are significant. And that's business expansion, business retention. I'm a small business owner. I've been a business owner for 20 years. You need to have those services in order for business to expand. So there's a ripple effect with local government aid, and that's we talked about this all the time with our business community. Our business community is supportive of local government aid because they understand those services that need to be provided for a business to want to expand, for a business to want to maintain in a community. So it has a spin-off effect to private industry, to livability. You do not want to live and expand your business in a community that doesn't have those basic services, and those basic services are jeopardized. And again, for us, local government aid is a regional center. We cannot pass that on to the property taxpayer, because Again, there's no reason. My neighbors, most of my neighbors are retired. I live in an older part of St. Cloud.
Yeah.
And they have not had increases in their COLA. They have no additional ability to pay, nor should they be taking up the burden for people coming in and using services in the community. So that's where local government aid comes in. And I think oftentimes legislators forget that. I can also talk about, some legislators will say, well, local government aid is just welfare for cities. Well, excuse me, St. Cloud collects in sales tax alone $61 million a year. We receive in local government aid $10 million a year. So the revenue that is generated in our community goes to St. Paul to pay for other services. It's not aid that's coming from some other community or from St. Paul or just being created somewhere. It's actually money that's generated in the community through our economic activity. So it is not aid. It's actually more of a misnomer. It's aid to the state. So allow us to have keep some of that money for regional centers in areas where there is a direct need, where the community may not generate sales tax revenue. Then you actually need Dave aid. That's why I've always said you should separate these two arguments, because cities should be, and again, the formula needs to actually reflect the service demand for a community, and those service demands are high for a community like ours.
With whom will you meet later today in the state capitol? And at this late hour, when the Republicans in the Senate and the House are close to unveiling their proposed budget, what will you say to them?
Well, I'll be talking to our area legislators. We have a number of St. Cloud we have 6 area cities, so we have a number of senators and House members in the area. So I'll be saying exactly what I said to you, which I continue to harp on that message. And again, I had the same message when I was a legislator for 11 years, so that hasn't changed as a mayor. I see it now as that perspective of trying to actually deal with those consequences that the state imposes on cities.
Yeah.
So I'll be talking to our legislators again in the same message that I've given over and over. And for some of our legislators, there are 3 legislators in our community. One is a former mayor and 2 are former city council members, so they should understand this no better than most folks here, the importance of that. And we have made those reductions. We have made those cuts. And I've always asked legislators, our budget is online. If you can find something in our budget you don't think we should be doing, highlight it and point to where that should be, where we should do that. We're getting to the point now, if we were to lose LGA, I often tell our folks, in the future, maybe what we need to do is just for our public safety, we'll just send the state the bill to pay for our public safety. Maybe the state wants to take that over. If there's no LGA, maybe you want to take over those costs. We'd gladly give up that cost and control if that's what they want to do. Those basic services that a state wants to do. In fact, our public safety budget alone is more than the LGA we get. So you can argue that I'd like to let someone tell us where there's frivolous spending in any way.
You made an important point a moment ago that your legislators have public sector experience in working on the municipal level. Koch and Zellers have said a few times during this session that they've almost bragged that a lot of the freshman legislators coming in with the Republicans since the November elections are from the private sector. They're private sector as opposed to public sector. How important is it to have public sector experience when you're in the legislature in St. Paul?
Well, I think it's important to understand, especially you get a lot of former mayors, former council members, school board members that come to the legislature. I think it's important to understand what effects one level of government has on other levels of government.
Yeah.
We talk all the time about local control, and that's what we're advocating to. Allow us that local ability, that innovation that I hear legislators oftentimes say, well, Washington should just allow us to do our own deal, we're a state. Well, that is the same philosophy that should be used at the state level for local communities. We can make the determination as to what we can do best at the local level. So I think that is important. It's important. I come from I have a little different aspect of that. I went to the local level from a legislative perspective, so I understand how legislative budgets are put together and the pressures that you have representing a region beyond just the one city area. But that same perspective is, I think, important for the legislators to understand levels of government. I think it's important to understand consequences of the actions that you take as the legislators on all aspects. Come from the private sector. And again, I'm a private sector individual too. I've owned a business for 20 years. So that type of perspective is important, but I think, again, you're representing a whole state. You need to understand the consequences. When a bill is passed, it has a significant amount of consequences, especially to another level of government that I always tell our legislators, we're elected by the same people. We have the same constituency. So you need to understand that. And again, that's the challenge that I think some folks have. But I think it's important to have both.
One more question. We appreciate the time. Given that you've been in the legislature, how will Governor Dayton and the legislature, the current legislature, reach compromise on this budget they have to come together with, whereas they seem to be so far apart right now?
Well, they have to. I mean, they're one of the aspects of, and that's something that cities, we deal with on a regular basis. We have to balance the budget. Our budgets have to, and ours are a little different because December 31st is we have to have it together for an annual budget. It's a little different for them, but they have no choice. State will shut down, and nobody wants that, nor should it. And I think an important aspect why I tell our legislators too is, what decisions you make have a tremendous rippling effect on a lot of budgets. School districts, for example, have to make those decisions now before the session will even end, and that's always been a problem. Cities, we have to make our decision, depending on what happens, with the rest of this year. We have half a year for the state's financial picture is a little different because it's on a biennium and we're on a calendar year budget. So they have to come to a compromise. There's no doubt about it. And the sooner the better. If they do not, it'll have devastating effects on all sorts of layers of government. And again, to me, the worst tax there is the property tax, because it is the tax that has nothing to do with the demand for services. It has nothing to do with the ability to pay. It has nothing to do, whether if you lose your job, you get a cut in pay, you still pay it. So that's the issue. It's a whole different thing on other aspects. So it has to be, the state has to have a balanced budget. And quite frankly, for all those other levels of government, the sooner it happens, the better. But there needs to be a willingness to come together and compromise before the end of this legislative session. So, and again, they have a tough job. There's no doubt about it. But we all do at all levels.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, take care.